Welcome back to Take a Leap and Transform, a neurodiverse journey. I'm your host, Joseph K. Muscat. Are you ready to take a leap with me? Our past journey shapes us, who we become. And this can be a double-edged sword because of how you know who you are supposed to be when the key element is not defined till much later in life, which changes your purpose in life. This is true for my next guest, Kristen Eccleston, who didn't discover she was ADHD until she was in her 30s. Dr. Kristen Eccleston, aka the Neurodiverse Teacher, areas of passion, expertise, and research focus on examining adolescent mental health impairments in the education environment, and she is well versed in the needs of the neurodiverse brain. Additionally, Dr. Eccleston professional expertise includes in-class teaching at the secondary level and designing and directing a specialized program for secondary students with mental health needs. Welcome, Christine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here today.
Well, I'm very excited to have you, and we have quite a lot to delve into. With neurodiverse guests, I always like to start off with their childhood education, especially
Mhm.
in your case, as you were not diagnosed much later in life. With that in mind, can you describe yourself and how you were seen by your teachers and peers and family?
Absolutely. So when I think back, I go all the way back to elementary school. I was definitely a child who early on, so at the kindergarten age, was identified as a student who was in what was called gifted and talented program. So I was showing signs of being smart, being engaged, and being really great at school. But like most children who are neurodiverse, often that usually kind of falls by the wayside as time goes on. And that did for me because I wasn't somebody who conformed to the one size fits all box of learning. If it wasn't exciting for me, I wasn't engaged. And oftentimes my report cards reflected somebody who was a social butterfly or needs to get their head out of the clouds or just needs to pay attention a little bit more. And so I had all the telltale signs of being inattentive ADHD, but in the time in the late 80s, early 90s, little girls didn't have ADHD. That was reserved for little boys who were bouncing off the walls and being disruptive in the classroom setting. And so I was just a social butterfly or somebody who had a lot of potential and just needed to concentrate or try a little bit harder or was lazy, which is a word that I hate when that gets associated with people who are neurodiverse. But that was something that was constantly shared with me. And so school was something that I didn't enjoy. I think I started off as a young child. I can remember in second grade wanting to be a teacher, enjoying school. And it was as time went on and maybe the expectations of school, maybe just the way that school is delivered to you and kind of a sit there and get talked at type of format, it just wasn't something I enjoyed doing. And so I really started to struggle with school and unfortunately, like many students who are neurodiverse and people don't know that they're neurodiverse, or even when they do, you get a lot of negative messages that are sent to you. And I want to say, come late elementary, early into middle school, and definitely through high school, I got a lot of those. You're so smart. If you just tried a little bit harder, or, you're not engaged, or you're not trying in my class, or I can even remember people with ADHD tend to be finger pickers if you're bored, right? You find your own things to engage yourself with. And I can remember my teacher calling me out into the hallway and yelling at me about how disrespectful I was being and that I wasn't engaged in their class. And those things really start to sink into to you as somebody with ADHD, and I didn't know that I did. So you're getting all these negative messages, and eventually you start to believe these negative messages because you believe that the teachers are the experts. I love my parents. My parents were incredibly supportive, but I think they were even looking at the teachers and the people in the education field as the experts. And what they were saying was obviously what they were going to go along with because they weren't familiar with what ADHD was or what that looked like. So they could only go based off what the teachers were reporting back to them. So I got a lot of those messages even at home of, you're so smart if you just tried a little bit harder. And what people don't realize oftentimes with people who are ADHD is you are trying as hard as you possibly can. You really are giving it your all. So when you get those, if you just tried a little bit harder messages, you really start to go, what is wrong with me? There must be something wrong with me. Maybe I'm not that smart, and people haven't figured out that I'm not that smart yet. And then you spend all this energy trying to mask that and not having people recognize that there's something wrong with you because you're so afraid that one day somebody's going to be like, you're stupid or something's wrong with you, or, why can't you do all these other things that I can do or your peers can do? And so you really start to develop almost a sense of anxiety because you're trying so hard to make sure that people don't realize that something is wrong with you when you yourself recognize, okay, something's off. I'm not obviously performing at the same level as my peers because I'm getting all these negative messages that I'm not trying the best that I should be when I feel like I am. And so I definitely had that type of experience going through school. And even when it was time to go off to college, I was not a great high school student. I was not somebody who had really great grades or SAT scores or anything like that. So I got to watch all my friends go off in the fall while I went to community college. And there's nothing wrong with community college, but it was hard at the time to watch my friends go off. And I waited till the spring until I could get into the college that I wanted to go off. And that was hard because, again, it just kind of still reinforced this concept that I had of myself that something is wrong with me and I obviously can't perform at the same level that my peers can.
There's just so many things in there. I mean, first off, it's kind of funny in the sense of you start to develop at a very young age because of not being diagnosed, because of the lack of, frankly, understanding and professionalism in the education industry. And because of this, you start to develop a mental health complex, as
Mm-hmm.
well as a poor self-esteem.
Yes.
Um, and it's kind of funny. I mean, my role was a little bit different because I was diagnosed at a very young age. But at the same time, you had a degree of understanding and support. But at the same time, they weren't experts in their field and they weren't fully trained, and they're trying to integrate you rather than trying to include you. It's also interesting. We see teachers. I mean, we kind of seen it, not to talk about the pandemic, but we saw it through the pandemic in the sense of we looked at the medical profession, and rightly so, as professionals, especially at the beginning stages when we didn't know what was going on. We needed to look to the experts. But then, of course, through the course of time, you come to the conclusion that as much as they are the experts, they don't know everything. And they're unfortunately guessing along the way. And regardless if it's the pandemic or another particular virus or a condition, they're they're poking and prodding, trying to find the solution, trying to understand what's happening, but they don't have all the answers. So sometimes you need to look outside of that particular profession to try to figure out what's going on. And I find that, I recently had a couple of conversations with some parents where they just dump their kids at school, trusting blindly that the education system, the teachers they're the experts. They're going to do the right thing. And the conversation I have with them is, you need to be involved. I know it's hard. I know you got work and other responsibilities, but you just can't be so blindly. You have to be involved because it takes both the education and the parents to be involved and understand what's going on. And the question I have for you is, it's kind of funny because it's one way or the other. Either you showing very clear signs, should I say, that you're struggling, and then they immediately try to figure out what's wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
Or you're doing extremely well and they miss. And then, as you indicated, which I know from my experience as well, that as things become more demanding as you go through the education system, then obviously the signs start really showing and you
Mm-hmm.
start to have difficulty. Why is it, coming from your educational background now, why is it that when things are going well, they don't notice?
I actually love that you asked me that question because my research specifically, when I was going through my dissertation and my doctorate, was looking at why are students with mental health needs often being missed when until they hit that wall, until there's like finally this moment of it's gotten so bad and we have to get such significant supports But how did it get missed? There had to be red flags along the way. And what my research found was that so many teachers just don't know what the signs and symptoms of mental health is. And I think that applies not to just mental health, but students who are neurodiverse. When you think about a teacher prep program, and I was a classroom teacher, you get taught how to write a good lesson plan. What do your mastery objectives look like? Maybe you get a classroom behavior management class, but it's all like, here's what you need to know about reading and making sure reading is happening in your classroom. But they never touch on this is what mental health looks like. Sure, if you're a special education teacher, they go into information about what different disabilities look like. But if you're a general education teacher, maybe you get one high level special education overview class, but you don't dive into it. And where do kids get first identified for mental health needs, for special education needs? They get identified by their classroom teacher. And I'm not putting blame on teachers. You don't know what you don't know, but if you don't know things, then you're going to miss things. And that is ultimately what my research found is teachers just didn't know what mental health looks like. And I would imagine if you did the same thing looking at neurodiversity, teachers just don't know what it looks like or they don't know what to do with it when they find it. And so I think oftentimes students get looked over because we often put our priorities in the wrong place. And I can actually give you a recent real world example of what I am saying. I had a student that I was advocating for recently who is dealing with mental health needs and was even telling this school team in a meeting that they felt suicidal, that they really felt so strongly against school that even that morning they were contemplating suicide. But at the time, their grades and their attendance were decent. And so the school, I even wrote down the quote because it boggled my mind so much. But essentially, the school team said to the student, well, despite your efforts are paying off despite your feelings. And I was just like, I can't believe you just said this to this kid because ultimately what you said in that statement was doesn't matter that you're feeling suicidal because at least your grades and your attendance are great. So even though you're feeling that way, your efforts and your grades and your attendance still look fantastic. So like it's okay that you're feeling that way. And that just like I couldn't believe that that was okay to say to a kid or that you would think that that's okay to say to a kid. And I think that's often how kids get overlooked, especially internalizing kids, kids who hold these feelings like I did, inward. Oh, I don't want anybody to know something's wrong with me. I suspect something's happening, but I don't want anyone to think something's wrong with me. And so you hold all of those feelings inward. I think what happens is these kids get missed because their grades are still decent, right? They're still coming to school. They still have at least C grades. And what I try to tell people is if you have a kid who their intelligence wise or capability wise should be making A's or shouldn't be getting the type of grades that they're having and they're getting C's, that is a red flag in itself. It really is a red flag because the kid is not performing at the level that that they're capable of. And so, yeah, they're passing, but something is obviously impacting them if they're not performing where they should be. And so I try to remind schools that just because a kid is coming and their grades are at least passing doesn't mean that everything is okay. You might just have a really highly intelligent kid who can get through, but is struggling, and we need to address that.
First off, you're right. The teachers are a product of the system. So it's not the teachers to blame, it's the system to blame. And if teachers are focused on lesson plans and getting the child from one grade to the next or passing the examination, then that's what they've been trained on. That's what they're focused on. And they don't have the skills to comprehend anything else. I was in a previous conversation where when we talked about neurodiverse training for teachers, someone blatantly said, impossible because it's too complicated for them. And I think, from the aspect as well, mental health might be too complicated for them. When we take a look at what you just stated here, yes, we can't believe that they made that statement, but they don't know what to say. And in their mindset, it's, well, look, you have great grades. This should cancel how you feel. And obviously, they're not looking for, they don't know what to say. and they don't know, they think that this is an answer to alleviate, when obviously it's not, and it requires a much more skilled professional to have a conversation. And I think that's another aspect as well, in the sense of when they made that statement, or any kind of statement like that, that is another example of where the focus is on integration, not
Mhm.
adapting to the child and trying to include them, or vice versa, including yourself into their world and how they see things and how they're feeling.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree with that. And again, like you said, I don't blame the teachers. I do blame the system. And because so many of these teachers, depending on what school district you work in or where you live in the world, but sometimes student performance is your job's dependent on it. And so you're motivated obviously by making sure you're getting paid and you can take care of yourself and your family. And if your expectation is you have to have kids who score, this amount on a certain test or have to be able to pass with this kind of proficiency, or your job is on the line, obviously that's going to put your motivation in different places. And I don't blame teachers for that. I blame the system that it's essentially making it so that teachers can't be more available for students and their needs because of the way the expectations have been structured, and that's not doing the teachers or the students a service.
Precisely. And that obviously brings into it, it's going to be another debate, and it's not going to be a question I'm going to ask, it's just going to be a statement I'm going to give,
Mhm.
which is obviously more resources need to be given to the education system, and more resources in the sense of that perhaps having one teacher in the classroom is not efficient. You have, comes down to co-teaching. You have one teacher who specializes on the class plan, and then you have another teacher who is specializes in neurodiversity to adapt to that lesson plan and transform that lesson plan to how that child learns. And then from there, you may need to have a teacher who specializes in mental health to be able to help those students or spot particular mental health concerns. And then the teacher may not necessarily may not need to be in the classroom every day, but is there to be able to observe and coach the other teachers on how to handle this student or group of students.
Absolutely, I agree with that. Recently, here in the States, the White House released a press release at the end of July talking about how there is a youth mental health crisis, and talked about all this funding that they're going to start pumping into schools, especially to increase the amount of social workers and school psychologists that are present in the school system, which I think is fantastic. But there was not one thing that mentioned teachers throughout the entire press release. And it goes back to this concern that I have is, if teachers again are the first line of defense because they're the ones who are with kids every single day in the classroom, it doesn't matter how many social workers or psychologists you have in that building, you have to have people who are going to be with those kids. So kind of how you were saying, somebody who's in the classroom to see and identify these things, but they have to have somebody who is in the classroom to see and identify it, even if it's just enough for the teacher to be able to identify it and then refer it out to that school psychologist or social worker. That's fine, but you still have to have teachers who understand and know what to look for in order for that resource or that support to be utilized.
I'm going to tell a personal story in this regards. A couple of years ago, or more than a couple of years ago, about 3 years ago, prior to the pandemic, my daughter was having anxiety and bullying issues. And being a parent who's neurodiverse and self-aware, before me, even my daughter was diagnosed, we were on top of these kind of things because we were more sensitive to it. And I had a conversation with the head of the teacher about, not providing support without having a diagnosis for her anxiety. I said, well, we're seeing it at home. And this is obviously the situation too, where the child behaves one way in the classroom, but doesn't behave that same way as they are at home. So it's trying to get their attention. And obviously the debate was, you need to get tested. And in the real world, she's not going to have this kind of support, which is again, a learned helplessness behavior. So let's fast forward to the pandemic and then the return to schools. And funny enough, I'm not sure, but I'm assuming that the same thing happened in the United States. all of a sudden the schools are flooded with counselors who are now hired full time to handle children's anxiety about returning back to the pandemic, which is kind of funny as a juxtaposition where that didn't exist 3, 4 years ago, but now because of COVID, it now suddenly exists. So, with that in mind, my daughter's having anxiety issues, not because of COVID, but just because of how her mind's thinking and so forth. And we had met the counselor prior uh, to get introduced her getting back into the school place. And so I said to her, if you're having these issues, make an arrangement to meet with your counselor. You know who your counselor is, go meet with them. So she starts meeting with the counselor and starts meeting with the counselor on a regular basis. So now comes parent-teacher interview. And obviously, because of confidentiality, the counselor didn't initiate meeting with me, but I initiated because I wanted to make sure that things were going well. And I said, obviously, because of confidentiality, you can't tell me certain things. I totally get that. But how's things going in general? Give me, the gist of it. And then she said to me during that conversation that it's kind of funny. I'm quite surprised and happy that she came to me, but she wouldn't have come to me under normal circumstances. And I go, why? Because the teacher would have noticed it and noticed particular anxiety and sent her, to come see me. So I'm quite happy and surprised and proud of her that she came to see me on her own. And that's a clear indication to what you're saying, that it's great that we have these counselors and these teachers may have been trained to spot anxiety in relation to COVID, not to anything else. So they did a training, but missed everything else. And my daughter or any other child would not have been spotted and sent for counseling otherwise.
And that's my concern. I mean, that was literally my concern when I read through that press release is we're missing the target, we're missing the boat a little bit. That I'm glad, I'm not against putting more social emotional supports into school systems. I think that's fabulous. But if we don't train the first line of defense, then those we're going to have all these people, but they're not doing what they're meant to be doing because those kids are not getting identified. And that was my biggest concern, is there was not one mention of how we were going to help improve teacher knowledge of it. And I will say that there are different trainings that are out there, and I know schools are working to address teachers being aware of mental health, but I have sat personally through those trainings, and it's being done at a surface level. I feel like it's like a one-time training. Now you're aware of it, but it's not really being integrated into the practice or into, the day-to-day culture of the school. And that makes a big difference in itself. But then I also see in procedures and processes that we get hung up on. I use this analogy all the time. You have a kid who's actively drowning, and we're busy picking out the color of the lifeboat instead of hauling the kid out of the water because we didn't have this observation, or we didn't have this rating scale, or we didn't. And I can't wrap my head around why we are putting procedures and processes above kids. Now, I'm not against procedures and processes. I get why they exist, but we have to look at the circumstances. Is this a kid who, it's a, not that I'm downplaying any disability, so I don't want it to seem as that, but I do see a kid who is on the verge of killing themselves as being a little bit of a more needs immediate attention type of situation. So if you have a kid who it's a standard, okay, they're struggling in school, what supports do we need to put in place? Time might be on your side, that there's the time to kind of think through, do some testing and get things figured out. You're aware of it, you're working with the kid. But when a kid says, hey, I'm thinking about killing myself and I'm thinking about doing it today because it's so bad, then time is no longer on your side. And the procedures and processes that are unfortunately not fast in the education system are now no longer, in my opinion, adequate, because we need to put the well-being of this child above, do we have the right observation or the right rating scale? Let's get the child out of the water. And then if we have to switch up the lifeboat, we can do that.
I love that analogy. That is a fantastic analogy. Too busy trying to choose the color of the lifeboat while the kid is drowning. That's a fantastic analogy.
I sadly have to use it way more often than I wish I did.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. systems and procedures, as you said, are important. But then there has to be, as you said, this major intervention where you just say, policies and procedures be damned. We have a fire to put out here, and the kid is burning, you know?
Yes.
All right, so we had a very long debate there, our discussion, as I say, about the education system. So I want to skip ahead now and discuss what led, in your 30s to this late diagnosis and how did this impact your life?
That is a great question. So I think I went into the doctor's office because I was dealing with anxiety, which I now know anxiety and ADHD often go hand in hand with one another. In fact, anxiety can often mask ADHD for a lot of people. And I think you create some of this anxiety because you are so busy trying to mask what you always knew was kind of this thing that was off about you. And so I went into the doctor and I was just kind of describing my feelings of what was going on, really looking for more relief with anxiety. And the doctor said, "Well, do you think that you're ADHD or that you could be ADHD at all?" And having been a special education teacher at that point in time for over a decade, I was very familiar with ADHD. And I had said to her, "Yeah, I kind of think I am a little bit of ADHD. I've worked with kids. I'm very familiar with what it is. I've always kind of considered myself probably being ADHD, but obviously I never sought an official diagnosis. I'm 30 at this point in time. I've pretty much made it through school." And she goes, "Well, let's do some rating scales and let's figure out if you are or you're not." So she went through the assessments that are associated with determining a diagnosis of ADHD. I did all the assessments and she's reviewing the outcomes and she says to me, "You're not a little bit of ADHD. You're a lot of bit of ADHD." And I was like, "Really?" I mean, I had expected for her to tell me I was, but I don't know that I had expected it to be to the extent that she found me to qualify to be ADHD. And so obviously I knew what ADHD was, I knew what it looked like, but like any new diagnosis you get, you go down this rabbit hole, and even TikTok. And I got diagnosed well before it was a TikTok trend to be ADHD. But just seeing now even more people on TikTok saying, these are my traits, these are my things, and it's just like it opens your mind and it kind of makes your life go, okay, so much about me makes so much more sense than it had prior. I get that, yeah, when it's something that I'm interested in, not only can I absorb the information quickly, I can pretty much become an expert on it overnight. And I'll give a real world example. I was set one time when I was a classroom teacher that I wanted to have a form, a computerized form where I could go in, I could observe teachers that I was overseeing, and it would generate this form email that we could send out to them right away and send data back to me right away. But you had to know how to HTML code in order to create this form. And I had never taken any kind of class. Well, by the end of that night, I knew how to HTML code and I had that form that I wanted because I was determined that I was going to have that form. And I feel like that's something that I had always done. If it's an area of interest or I get fixated on something, I can quickly absorb the information and I can almost become an expert on it pretty quickly. However, on the flip side, if it's something that I don't have interest in, I really do not feel excited about the information, but it's something that I have to know or absorb, or it is painful. And I try to explain to people it's not a physical pain, but there is like this mental anguish that comes with it, that it's just like it's not comprehending. And it's not that I don't have a capability to comprehend. My brain is more or less like a mind of its own, essentially. And it's like, yeah, this is not exciting for me. So, like, I'm just going to be checked out over here. You let me know when it's over, type of thing. And it's almost impossible to absorb the information. Now, as an adult, you come up with tricks and things because there are things that you can't get around, you have to know or be exposed or have a working knowledge of. But it is very, very difficult when it's not something that you find exciting. And so I will say that when I did get the diagnosis in my 30s, it made a lot more sense. I did get a diagnosis prior to going after my doctorate. So I had already gone through getting my bachelor's, getting my master's undiagnosed, and they were not a walk in the park. I definitely had struggles, but having the diagnosis made it make sense to me why those struggles existed. And I will say, even now knowing that I have ADHD going into my doctorate, I still have the same struggles. And even with being able to say to people now, well, hey, I do have ADHD and this is why this is hard for me or not, you didn't find any you didn't find a lot more sympathy or support or people who were willing to do anything just because now you know and you're willing to say, hey, yeah, I recognize I'm struggling in this area, but this is why. And it was kind of eye-opening to me that it just shows that people were aware of it now, we're more in tune to what it is, but there's still this level of expectation that I'm not going to cut you any slack just because, like, I still expect you to be integrated, as you're saying, into this neurotypical expectation instead of meeting you where you're at. And I learn things differently. I like to learn things differently, and when it's something I love or I'm interested in, I can learn it in a neurotypical way because the interest is there. But when it's not, trying to learn in a neurotypical way is very, very hard. So on one hand, I definitely think it helped. I will say maybe there were some advantages to a late diagnosis. So much of what I do now are coping strategies that I naturally had to develop as an adult in order to be successful. But I also feel like it would have been nice to maybe have some of that sympathy, and not even sympathy, it's not the right word, but having people who are willing to be flexible with you or teach you the way that you need, or have those coping strategies not come from a place of stress or urgency, but coping strategies that people were just helping you develop. So often I felt like as a kid I was a fish who was being asked to climb a tree, and you're just not going to be able to do it. But if you gave me the skill sets that I needed, pulley system with a bucket or something, then I could have been that fish who was climbing that tree. And I think that would have been nice to have. And that's my biggest thing now is I don't want kids who are neurodiverse to have to go through a 10-year period like I did leaving college up until I was 30 something, of trying to finally rebuild your confidence and go, wait a second, actually, I think I'm a lot smarter than I ever gave myself credit for. If I could get in a time machine today and go back to my high school self and say, hey, these are all the things you're going to accomplish and you're going to achieve and you're going to be able to do, high school me would have been like, I think you're on crack or something, lady. Like, I don't know what you think is happening here, but I don't think I'm capable of those things. I would have never believed it. And so much of that was because of those negative messages that I was getting. And it took me 10 years to essentially break that and finally go, actually, I'm not giving myself enough credit. I can do a lot more than I realized I could do. And I hate thinking of other young people having to do that, because I feel like that's 10 years where you could have been dedicated to something. That's 10 years where if you have the cure for cancer in your brain, you could have been spending it unlocking those types of things, not having to spend 10 years doubting yourself and finally waiting for that aha moment of like, oh, wait, actually, I think I'm
Yeah, I mean,
capable of a lot more.
I cannot disagree by any means. Like, and again, it comes back to the education system where we're so focused on grades and SATs, and what have you in regards to examination. We miss so many other elements that needs to be focused and taught. And I mean, you were diagnosed late, I was diagnosed early, but in the end, we both end up in the same pot where our self-esteem is being affected. We have a very negative self-image of ourselves. We don't feel confident. And if only that was built early, so it needs to be integrated in the education system. And in some ways it is. If you are a good athlete or you love, playing sports, they focus on that. If you're a good mathematician, they focus on that. But then, everything else falls off to the wayside again. And if you're not, then, you're average and good job and next student, please. The self-image and projecting a self-image really needs to be taught in the classroom and at such a very
Mm-hmm.
young age. And again, it comes from a hand-in-hand situation. It requires the education system as well as the family. And having that early diagnosis and developing that proper self-image and self-esteem right at that point, because all of a sudden now you're hit with a baseball bat from the back of the head, and then you look at what happens in your case, and I can understand what you're trying to do. You don't want kids to basically play catch up, because now they're behind because of that late diagnosis and because of that developing that self-esteem at such an early age. Now, it's kind of interesting as well that you pointed out that it's a very interesting observation that you've you've identified with your colleagues that you're ADHD and their behavior doesn't change, rather than they expect that your behavior to change and that you meet their expectations. It's really interesting about human behavior in that aspect where we're not willing to adjust and we're not willing to adapt. You're the one who has to make the adjustments. Otherwise, society
Mhm.
and them will through social norms will make you pay the consequences.
Absolutely. And that's what I experienced. I feel like there was times where I got sympathy or empathy based on it, but it was like you still have the expectation that you need to hit this mark. And so um figure out how to hit that mark. It doesn't matter that you have ADHD, in order for you to achieve, you have to hit the mark, and we want you to hit the mark using this formula or this format. So figure out what you need to do in order to do it. I'm sorry that it's difficult for you. Do you know what I mean? Like, and I feel like that's kind of the underlying message that you get. Or, people with ADHD, sometimes we make mistakes, and it's not mistakes that are, our brains move really, really fast. And I want to say that, sometimes they call them careless mistakes, and they're not things that we do on purpose. Like I can tell you, it takes me forever to send an email because I probably read it 20 times before I finally will hit the send button, because I had so many times early on in my career where I made a mistake and somebody, reamed me out that how dare you misspell or miss this word or whatever it is that I did. And now, that's a trauma response, probably why I read it 20 times. But I feel like oftentimes we don't allow any grace. We only get fixated, or neurotypical people only get fixated on the negative aspects that come along with somebody who's neurodiverse. And we don't focus enough on the really amazing things that come with people who are neurodiverse. You know, people who are neurodiverse can do a week's worth of work in a day because their brain can function. And when they hyperfixate and they get in the zone, I mean, they can get incredible things done. They can see solutions where people only see problems. They work great under stress and under pressure. They're able to be super creative and come up with these out of the box ideas and concepts where other people are stuck on things or can't problem solve or move past something. People who are ADHD, if you had a plan and something doesn't go your way, sometimes people get stuck. Like, I don't know what to do. Like, it didn't go the way I thought it was going to. People with ADHD are great at like pivoting and saying, okay, well, we can do it this way, and they can do it on the spot. There's so many positives, but we get hung up on the you were 5 minutes late to work today, instead of like, look at these amazing things that you produce. And I'm not saying that people with ADHD shouldn't have expectations. If anything, people with ADHD need to have expectations in order to make sure that we're doing the things that we do. But I think when there's a little bit of grace, and you can see okay, this is, I know, not a strength of yours, but where your strengths do lie are so incredibly valuable. That's a big message to give to somebody who is neurodiverse, that like, yes, you have these areas of weakness, but your areas of strength are like, I'll deal with these areas of weakness because what I'm getting from you because of your areas of strength are far beyond an expectation or what I would hope to have an employee. So thank goodness I have you, type of thing. That would go a long way, I think, with somebody who's neurodiverse.
As a human species, a defense mechanism, the lizard brain, we tend to focus on the negative
Mm-hmm.
because it's a defense mechanism, whatever it is. And as a result, we
Yep.
don't focus on the strengths. There's that fear. And we need to figure a way, because we've been conditioned in this way, both evolution wise and socially, that
Mm-hmm.
we don't focus on the strengths and we tend to focus on the negativity, and we focus on the sense of that there needs to be conformity. And yeah, to a degree there does, but that also requires, for conformity to be
Mm-hmm.
successful, there needs to be adaptability and more inclusion. And we need to,
Yeah.
I think part of the problem as well is in that current thinking, we're thinking from a vertical viewpoint rather than a horizontal viewpoint. So it's always about, you need to
Yeah.
achieve this if you want to be treated this way, rather than focusing on
Yeah.
this is, where your goals are. We're going to help you achieve those goals. And each time you achieve those goals, or even if you're trying hard, you're going to get recognized. And of course, that also have to
Mhm.
going back to a bit of backlash of everybody gets a reward. It's not about everybody getting a reward. It's about recognizing and building self-esteem in the appropriate way in the appropriate areas. So when you look back now, how do you feel from education to adulthood to your workplace? Because you've also highlighted quite a number of challenges that you face in the workplace. How do you feel about your ADHD?
I love that I have ADHD. I don't look at it as a negative. Do I have weaknesses? Sure. But does a neurotypical person have weaknesses? Absolutely, they do. So I don't see being neurotypical or being neurodiverse as being better than the other. I just look at my brain looks at the world this way. Your brain, as a neurotypical person, looks at the world that way. And not one is better than the other. They're just two different ways. Where we get this hang up is that the world was designed for the neurotypical brain, not the neurodiverse brain. And that's why I think people put the word disorder with things or look at it as a negative thing. When, in my opinion, in my mind, it's not a negative thing. We think of it as a negative thing, but that's because we've put that onus on it, not because it is. So I actually love that I'm ADHD. I love that it allows me to do some of the things that I can do. I love that if I get hyper fixated on something and I want to know how to do all the things associated with it, I can do it. I love when people, if I'm in a work environment and people go, who has experience in this or this or that, I'm constantly raising my hand because I have tried all those things. I've been all those jobs. I've explored those interests, and I think because people with ADHD have lots of interests, so they have lots of different experiences, and I feel like that's just part of who I am, and so I love that. I like that that's who I am. I accept that. I don't look at it as this negative thing. I'm sad that the world will sometimes see it as a negative thing, but I think that's a lot of why I'm here talking to you, or I have a podcast, or I talk because I want to start changing that mindset in general, that it doesn't have to be this negative thing. We have created this as being a negative thing, but it's not. We're on the same playing field. We're just looking at the world through two different lenses. That's all. That's all that it is. And yeah, I have this weakness or that weakness, but I also have these really incredible strengths that I bring to the table that can be a game changer type of strength. And sometimes the only wish I had was that I recognized that at 22 and not 35, because I would have really have loved to have had that more than 10-year period of really building my confidence in myself and going out there and achieving. I'd love to know, where would I be in my life now if I had known this at 22, what I knew, and I'm older than 35 now, but when I was even 35, and that idea started to hit me that, hey, I can do more than I've been giving myself credit for. Where would I be if I had realized that at 22? Why did it have to take me more than a decade to finally hit that? That's probably my only one regret. But other than that, I love that I have ADHD because I think I bring a lot to the table as being somebody who
Fantastic,
has
absolutely
ADHD.
fantastic. And I think that it's a both a mental and society maturity point of why it took so long. Um, but you're right. Why did it have to be so long? I mean, that maturity would have come regardless. Just if you had been identified earlier, you would have been able to manage and perhaps even focus more clearly of where your purpose is. And that brings us to I mean, you've indicated that you are a former teacher, and we've indicated now that you are a mental health consultant and advocate. So let's start off with one, how did you get into what you're doing now from a teacher to being a mental health advocate for students?
That's a great question. A lot of that has to just do with life circumstances. I don't know that I ever set out to do what I'm doing right now. I was very happy. I had been a special education teacher. I loved being a special education teacher. I think part of my passion and love was I could relate to kids as having been somebody who struggled or didn't like school. I think that was part of why I wanted to be a special ed teacher, is I knew how it felt and I wanted to try and help kids any way I could to not have those same experiences in the education setting. And towards the end of my in classroom teaching career, I had the opportunity to build a special education program specifically for high school students with mental health needs. And I saw it as such a prevalent need. And this was prior to the pandemic. I had no idea the handwriting on the wall there. I just saw it as a current need, having no idea that it would explode to the level of need that it is today. And that is what encouraged me to go back to school and get my doctorate. I really wanted to understand, why are these kids getting missed? Why is it taking sometimes till their junior or senior year of high school for them to finally get the level of support they needed? And that's what I focused on. And unfortunately, during the time that I was getting my doctorate done, just life circumstances, it was like one life circumstance after another of things with that were work related, things that were related to student mental health that became significantly intense, my mother having throat cancer, I ended up having kidney surgery. It was like just one thing after another for a while. And it ultimately was like the universe was trying to give me a huge sign of like, hey, you need to shift gears. And I took a leap of faith and I left the education setting. And I was fortunate. There were people who I think recognized what my passions were, as far as education and youth go. And I was able to start doing education advocacy work. And so I made it so that I really only focus on students with mental health needs. And so I support all the way elementary school all the way through high school. So, ages 6 through 21 of students with various mental health needs and how it's impacting them in the education setting. And I go to meetings with families, I help walk them through the process. But I've also started to shift gears and working on trying to do things on a larger scale as well too, because I love supporting the families and the students that I do, but it definitely feels like an uphill battle at times when you're trying to support just one student at a time. And I had been very fortunate in building a successful high school program. And so now that's part of my next phase or next journey, is really trying to take that nationwide and helping other school systems build those types of programs, helping them keep funding within their school district instead of having to pay for private placements for students. And ultimately, I think students get a better education that way as well. And starting to spread this message, similarly to what you do at the corporate level too, of, there's a workforce that exists now and is definitely up and coming, of youth who are neurodiverse. And if you want to retain employees and have good positive value and engagement, then we have to start understanding, what does this look like and mean for our employees, and start really working with our employees to help them feel valued, and be that person who we focus more on all these skills and these gifts that you have, and not on some of these areas of deficit that we can look past, since you have all these amazing
Yeah,
skills
I
and
mean,
gifts
it's
to
interesting.
offer.
I don't know why, because at the end of the day, the education system is the precursor, obviously, to the workplace. And we know that certain universities, colleges, um, faculty departments have conversations with employers and saying, is our courses, is our program relevant? What's new and up and coming? Are students fit for purpose? If those kinds of conversations are occurring, then why are they not having the same conversation and saying, are you aware that 1/4 of our upcoming graduating class and the graduating class before them and the graduating class coming after them is neurodiverse? This is what we've had to accommodate for them. And this is what we recommend that you need to accommodate for this talent in your workplaces. And these are their strengths. So that, never mind the accommodations, this is where you need to focus and place them in your various companies and departments to excel and help bring profit.
The only thing I can think of, because I've had that same thought cross my mind too. The only thing I can think of is I go back to myself, and when I was going through and getting my bachelor's, I didn't have my diagnosis, and I did struggle when I first went to college. It was a little bit of a transition period, I think, and I mainly struggled when you had to take all those gen ed courses that that are a requirement for most degrees. But then once I got into my major, I did very well. And when I think back on it, it was an area of interest. And so I all of a sudden it was like this light bulb went off, like, oh, I'm actually okay at school. But it was because it was solely an area of interest that I had to dedicate myself to. So I don't know that anybody would have noticed, especially at the collegiate level, where it's not always small class sizes, or that you have intimate relationships with your professors, that anyone would have noticed or picked up on the fact that I was ADHD. And then now, because I only have to focus on things that I enjoy doing, it wouldn't be as prevalent either. So that's the only thing I can think of is there might be a lot of people, young adults, who are like me and are not being seen at, they made it through high school, nobody identified them. Now they're definitely not getting identified in college because they're actually maybe even doing a little bit better because they can focus on an area of interest. And now it's not till they get to the workforce. And we all know sometimes your first job out of college, it's not always the most luxurious job. And there's tasks that you might not be super excited about. And I feel like work to a degree kind of goes back more to the structure of what high school looked like more than what college looked like. And now that you're kind of back in that structure, that might be where you start to now have some of those issues that you once faced start to come back into your life. So I don't know that that is the exact answer, but I feel like that's the only thing I could come up with to kind of soothe my mind when I ask myself the same question that you ask of how is this getting missed and why are they
I
not
kind of
talking
agree
about
with what
these
you're
things?
saying. What you're saying is definitely one element. Um, and with that said, on the flip side of that, I know speaking to post-secondary education institutions locally and internationally, their argument coming from those who are in the departments of neurodiversity is that they're filling in the gaps of kids coming up into post-secondary. These are kids who are struggling in the post-secondary aspect, and it's because they were missed and not identified. So there is a degree of late diagnosis happening at the post-secondary level because it didn't happen in high school or elementary. So it for those in Europe that depending what country you're in, of course, that will be like Form 6 versus Form 7, if I got that correctly. I've lived in Malta for 8 years, and I'm still thinking North American when it comes to education. I haven't quite understood the European, which is based on or Maltese education, which is a lot based on the UK system. There's Form 5 and Form 6 and what have you. So anyways, I think Form 6 or Form 7 is post-secondary, and below that is what would be equivalent of senior school or high school. So they're filling in the gaps. So that's another element to what you're saying, and when what you're saying is an element to what I'm saying. So it's obviously it's not a perfect system, but somewhere along the line we need to shrink in that funnel and bring the diagnosis sooner. So I'm interested, Kristen, in the aspect of your program, because what your program sounds really fascinating, and obviously not getting into too much detail. Can you explain what that program is, and also because you're also working with parents. So with that in mind, when do you get how and when do you get involved? Is it parents coming to you? Is it the school coming to you? Is it the student coming to you?
No, it's a great question. It's typically parents seek me out or seek out. I'm with Weinfeld Education Group, where I'm a director there of their social emotional services program, and it's typically parents seek us out, and it's for a couple of different reasons. Either they feel like the school system is not listening to them, they have concerns over their child's education, and feel like they're not getting the response back from the school that they're hoping for, or they're just at a frustration level that the child is school avoidant or is not getting supports, and or they feel overwhelmed by the special education process because it really is a process with that oftentimes has its own language associated with it, and if it's not of your every day, I can see where it would become overwhelming. So I have parents come to me for kind of a multitude of reasons. It's either they want the support to go through the procedures and processes, or they don't feel like the school is listening to them and they want me to come be a third party person within it. So there's a couple different reasons why they might come to me and ask for that support. And then for the program that I created and that I want to help other school districts create. So in law in the US, there's something called FAPE, free and appropriate public education, which means that if a student with an IEP, an individual education plan, its needs cannot be met by the school district that they go to, then that school is responsible essentially for funding either a non-public or a private placement that can meet that child's needs. But those placements are not cheap placements, and that funding is then used by the school system, has to pay for it. And so many of the students that were dealing with significant mental health needs were having to go into private placements. And to be honest, there's not a lot of stuff out there. There's things that exist. And you often run into the aspect of they're either incredibly full and they don't have space, or just the resources are very limited. And so the program that I created was specifically for students with mental health needs. If you could wave the magic wand, make the mental health needs go away, you would have kind of your typical performing 16-ish-year-old student. But it's a small self-contained, it's in a comprehensive building, so your typical local high school building, but it has its own little area. There was a full-time social worker, there were teachers who were special education teachers, the class sizes were smaller, and it was really meant to be as individualized as possible for the student and essentially be a reset button. I mean, a lot of the students who were coming to us had been either school avoiders or had been hospitalized at some point in time, and it was really trying to meet them where they were at and individualize the setting for them and build them back up to being at a point where they could be back in that comprehensive building and they could navigate, and it wasn't as overwhelming for them as when they initially
Okay,
came to the
fantastic.
program.
That's really incredible and very helpful. So with the time, I'm sure there
There's a lot
is.
more detail to it, but if people want to know, they can get in touch with me, and I'm
Absolutely.
happy to
So
help.
that brings me to with the time that we have left. Last three questions here. Question number one. Obviously, you're
Sure.
coming from a North American system, and I'm currently living in Europe
Yes.
and have frankly, a more European audience, even though I do have a North American audience. So is your
Mhm.
program applicable to non-North American?
Absolutely is, because it's tailored for the student. So much of what education now is this one size fits all. But what this program does, and I mean, we had 40 to 58 students. So it wasn't like we could only do it with 5 or 10 students. You can do this with a large set of students. It's all about how you structure it and what type of supports you put into place. But it's a program that is meant to be in a comprehensive building. It's not meant to be hidden away someplace, because part of trying to get these students back integrated into the school system, you need to have access to a comprehensive building. But it is designed to meet students where they're at. It is designed to, if you are school avoidant and we need to spend time just helping you touch the front door of the school, then that's what we're going to spend time doing. And we're going to come up with ways to help you still get your education while we're working through that. Or if it was just a setting situation of where you were coming from, it was a loud, crowded hallway and it was hard for you to navigate. But now that you have this kind of more relaxed setting and you come every single day, that's great. Let's work on getting you caught up and getting you up to speed. It only had 40 to 58 students in it, but that's still equated to smaller class sizes that had multiple people in the classroom. Like we talked about, it had a special education teacher, it had a support professional in there, it had access to a full-time social worker so that mental health piece could be addressed. So there were a lot of pieces in there, and to me it is applicable everywhere. It's all student oriented and student based, and it's to help students be successful. And on the flip side, for the school district, it helps keep some of that funding in school, because now you're not having to pay for some of those private placements for students. And ultimately, I think students get a better education because they're being exposed to that district or that school system's professionals and teachers. And so I would hope that most school districts believe in their staff, and so you would allow them to be retained there. So I think overall it leads to a better school experience for the student, and is helpful to that district, especially with what we're dealing with teacher exodus. If you have some funding that you get to retain, then hopefully you can do some really
Fantastic.
great things
Obviously,
with that.
the funding aspect might be different from country to country, region to region. So is there, without
Absolutely.
giving too much detail, a particular case study that you can give that you've helped a family and their child?
Sure, I absolutely can. So I had a student at one point in time who had missed their entire 10th grade year due to hospitalizations. They came to us their junior year, so 11th grade, so 17 years old, just depending on how it equates for different school systems. So they had missed an entire year of schooling. And the way school is set up in the US is you can miss some education and still graduate on time. You have 4 years to get through high school, but the amount of credits that you need to get, you can really get it done in 3.5 years, and then they're kind of extra credits beyond that. So the student wasn't at so much of a risk of not being able to graduate on time, but they came to us 11th grade, obviously a little bit resistant to the fact that they were having to leave their home school setting, the fact that they had been out of school for an entire year. And 11th grade, the start to 11th grade was kind of hard for them. They were resistant, but we really just worked on building their confidence back up. Like that was our primary focus. Is I always say as educators, I can teach you, but if you're not available for learning, then there's not a lot I can do. So I always say, let's put those relationships first and get you to a place where you are then available for the learning. And with this particular student, that's what we spent most of the start of their junior year doing. And by senior year, and so this was after 10th grade of not going to school at all, being in and out of the hospital. By their senior year, so 17, 18 years old, they were completely back in mainstream classes. We essentially were just a safety net for them. They were taking AP level, so high level classes. I think they had 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 of those. They graduated on time. They went to university from there. So it really showed for this particular student. And this is not even the only student that this applies to. I could give you multiple versions of this type of story with different circumstances, but it showed that once the setting was appropriate and we really went back to that reset of making sure that their mental health and their relationships were in a good place, then they were available for learning and they were able to go off and they were able
Amazing.
to
That's an
succeed.
amazing story and an amazing accomplishment, and well done to that student. And I can definitely see that there's that resistance that happens. You see that in particular, regardless of mental health or neurodiverse. So my last question, Kristen, is how can people find you?
Absolutely. So people can find me 2 very easy ways. The first one is through my website, which is www.theneurodivers.teacher.com, or on social media at the.neurodiverse.teacher. And then everything is all linked together.
Fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Well, thank you, Kristen, for your wonderful time and sharing your personal story and your advocacy of how you support students and families.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I truly appreciate it.
Well, this brings us to an end of our podcast and our great guest and interview. I want to share with you a new program that I put together to bring awareness to up-level the skills of employers and management. The workshop aids in building more inclusive environments in the workplace and in developing the skills of management to be more engaging with their teams. Reach out to me on my website to learn more about this amazing program. I also encourage you to continue to support this podcast so I can bring you more amazing content. You can do so by visiting my Patreon page. Till next time, take a leap and transform.